Did any of the following actually happen as described in these scary stories? Welcome to Scary Stories NYC. I'm your old pal Bigfoot, presenting you with over 2 hours of Dogman stories that took place in unexpected locations. Let's start right away with this newest tale sent to us by one of you who claims that I saw a dogman climbing the Brooklyn Bridge. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I was working as a driver for an Uber-like service in New York back in spring when the COVID thing was first getting really serious. It was the last night I was going to be able to drive before the restrictions were going to hit us, and I was trying to earn as much as possible that night for obvious reasons. I really thought I wasn't going to be able to work at all after that, but that ended up not being the case. We just had to wear masks and that sort of thing. Still, I was panicking that night. I was drinking a lot of coffee to stay awake, and I was driving everybody everywhere. I remember coming back to Manhattan at almost midnight, driving over the Brooklyn Bridge, wondering if I might be able to get another fare before giving up for the evening. I looked up into the sky because I thought I saw part of the iron working above me giving away. I instantly panicked, with adrenaline shooting through me. But when my eyes reached the place where I thought I saw iron bars caving in and falling, I didn't see anything of the kind. The bars were all still firmly held in place, and what had attracted my attention from my side vision was in fact what I at first took to be a man dancing on top of the bars. This was nearly as upsetting as what I at first thought was happening, as now I was afraid this man was either going to fall or jump. Traffic wasn't that heavy, and I slowed down just a bit in order to allow myself time to look up and squint at the scene above me. When I did, I saw that I was in fact seeing a man in a werewolf costume, sort of most resembling the monsters in the Dog Soldiers movie. It had to be a man in a costume, because werewolves don't exist. He was running on the bars, and for 2 full strides, about a second or two, I saw him fully lit and very clearly. The costume, if that's what it was so perfect that his arms looked too long to be human, and his legs looked too canine to be human either. I was wondering how human legs could even fit into a costume like what I was viewing, when a loud beeping from behind reminded me that I was driving on the Brooklyn Bridge and not sightseeing in Central Park. I hit the gas, and I was unable to look up again. When I got back to Manhattan, I drove around for a while looking for a spot with a good view of the bridge to see if the thing was still there. The lights were against me though, and after a while I gave up. After finding out there were no more fares for the evening, I went home and crashed. Still, as stressed out as I was that night, I know what I saw, because for 1 second or maybe 2, it ran through very bright lighting. It was brown. It was tall. It either had a dog head or wore a dog head-shaped mask. By that I mean it had a long snout, and it had wolf-like ears up on top. They were too far away for me to tell if the ears moved like a dog's ears or if they stayed still as they would in a mask. It really looked like a non-human creature, but again, I was beneath it and viewing it from my car through glass while driving. I can't say for 100% certain that this was a werewolf or a dogman, but it makes far more sense to me personally than to think it was a cosplayer who was risking his life up there, wearing oddly shaped boots that would seem to be very hard to balance upon. That had to have been something other than a human. It reminded me of that old movie that Whitley Strieber wrote about the wolves who were really native shamans. I forget what it's called. Was it Wolfman? But that was the one that was mostly set in the Bronx. This creature did not look like a wolf. It didn't look like the wolves from that old movie either. It looked like an odd sort of dog-headed, dog-legged man, I guess you could say. And since this was right at the beginning of the pandemic, it just makes sense to me that it might have been one of them, about to move in to one of the areas emptied out when so many of our neighbors split the scene last year and flew south for the dark winter. But then again, I have no photos or proof, and in all honesty, I can't tell for sure what I really saw when I saw Dogman climbing the Brooklyn Bridge. Dogman in the darkened subway station. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I've got a Dogman story that took place in the city, and I've got a subway story that took place up in the air. One night, many years ago, I saw an actual Dogman in the actual Bronx inside an actual train station across from an actual cemetery. This all happened on a cold night in November sometime in the late 1980s. I was just 21 and I had taken to staying out till dawn with my friends in Manhattan. We would go to rock shows downtown. I would get home at dawn, but my parents lived in Yonkers, so that meant leaving long before dawn. No matter how much I had partied that night, I'd be sober and freezing by the time I reached the last stop on the number 4 train in the Bronx. From there, I would have to go downstairs from the elevated train station and catch myself a cab over by the cemetery and the golf course. I didn't really like doing that because the cab drivers in those days were not always honest, especially if they thought you were sleepy, or even if they thought they could take you in a fight and keep anything valuable you had on you. So I would make sure I was awake and alert, and I would try to look as tough as a 21-year-old kid could, not to mention as poor as a 21-year-old kid could. If you looked and acted poor, you were halfway home. If the driver tried to make conversation, I would just answer as though I were broke. It was a lot safer that way. So I was rehearsing all this in my mind as I walked alone down from the subway platform up over the avenue, down onto the next landing. There was the platform level, the intermediate level where you could buy more tokens or cross to the other side if you missed your stop, and then there was the staircase down to the street. Except as I walked down those steps that night, I could see that the intermediate level was not lit. It was completely dark. My heart skipped a beat as I wondered what was going on. They didn't have anyone in the token booth at night anymore in those days, but they had always left the lights on. I wondered if there might be a different way to get down to the street, and I went back up on the platform to see. I did notice another staircase, and I began walking toward it. But when I got there, I could see that it either led down to that same intermediate level, or else this one had also had all the lights turned off. I didn't know what I could do except go down into the pitch blackness and try to suss out as quickly as possible if there was anyone down there in the dark looking to do me harm. I walked 3/4 of the way down the staircase as quietly as I could, but still causing little echoes, and I squinted into the darkness. It took me a second or two, but I recognized the way to go from the little bits of ambient lighting coming in from the streets outside and below. I just needed to make a run for the turnstiles. The stairs to the street should be just beyond them. Hesitating, I listened, praying that if anyone were there in the darkness, they would make a noise right then and give themselves away. Nobody did, so I broke into the uncoolest, most frightened run in my life, charging for the turnstiles just in case someone was waiting there to ambush me. I'm certain I looked like a complete fool. As my reward, once I got past those turnstiles, this big-headed monster leaped out from my left at me, barking like a dog. In that first second, I thought it was the alien from Aliens jumping at me barking, and I screamed like Shirley Temple in a horror movie. I hurt my own ears, I was so high-pitched. I'm surprised the glass in the station didn't crack from it, I'm telling you. While still screaming like a young girl, I turned and looked directly at this alien monster. It was a dog. It was a mutant dog, covered in slime and filth. It had a huge, savage head, full of immense dog fangs, and it was standing up like all mutant dog-headed monsters should. I ran backward for the staircase, slipped, and rolled a third of the way down before catching myself and racing the rest of the way down, crying. The dog-headed monster man never left the shadows. I don't think it chased me at all. Some cab drivers waiting below on the street were pointing at me and laughing. They were so amused, I had brought tears to their eyes. Had they set me up? After all, how could they see me coming down from the station, but not have seen the Dogman going up? That area has Van Cortlandt Park and Cemetery, and there's a golf course too. Although the streets are grimy and very New York, there's an awful lot of nature in that area as well. If the Dogman could live in any part of the Bronx, I would guess maybe there. But this thing looked more like it lived in the sewer than in the park. If I saw it in an underground subway station, I would guess that this thing lived deep under the earth, like a chud. But I didn't see it underground. I saw it in an elevated train platform in the Bronx. It either had to come up from the streets or down from the platform. That was when I got the bright idea that maybe the Dogman did live underground, and that it got on the train back in Manhattan where it does run through tunnels underground. Maybe that wasn't a Bronx Dogman at all, but a Brooklyn or a Manhattan one that had gotten lost far from home. I checked the newspapers the next day, but nobody reported anything strange happening at Van Cortlandt Station. I actually took a cab into the Bronx from Yonkers that day just to look at the station in the daylight. It looked completely normal, like nothing had happened. It was busy. It was just the same as usual. I would have wondered if I dreamed it, but I know I didn't. I know I really saw Dogman in the darkened subway station. Please join me in thanking Mary Shabazz. She's our executive producer and all that jazz. If you'd like to become a Scary Stories executive producer like Mary Shabazz, just join our paid subscribers club at peterbernard.com or click the join link under this video. PQ Ribber will be back at the end of this episode to explain in more detail, but right now we've got a second Dogman story, and it's called I Stupidly Idolized the Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, when I was younger, I was a really big Dogman fan. I mean, I was a huge Dogman fan. I lived and breathed Dogman. I listened to Dogman shows. I read Dogman blogs. I watched Dogman movies and YouTube channels, and I was a Dogman maniac. A dog maniac, I suppose. I wasn't just interested in the Dogman. I wanted to be the Dogman. I felt as though, in some ways, I already was the Dogman. I knew deep in my heart that if I ever ran into a Dogman in real life, he and I would react to each other as brothers. I felt certain he would recognize in me a kindred soul. And then, last week, I was delivering lumber for my uncle up in Revere, Pennsylvania, and as I drove home, I got a flat tire on Route 563 in the vicinity of Lake Nockamixon. Now, I didn't have any of these fancy modern devices or whatever, and my pickup truck was not a smart car. I mean, it was smarter than me, but it was still pretty dumb. My girlfriend and I had a cell phone, but I left it home with her. I had a spare tire, and I was going to change it myself in the dark alone. I don't have a problem with any of that. I wasn't born with any kinds of spoons in my mouth or anything. But what I do have a problem with is the Dogman choosing that moment, of all moments, to finally introduce himself to me. Now, first of all, I want to say that I've always told everyone that I believed in the Dogman, and I've argued with anyone who said he didn't exist. I told everyone I knew that I was a believer, and I didn't think I had the slightest doubt that Dogman was real. In spite of all that, when I finally saw that Dogman on that night, it was like a divine revelation. Even though I knew he had to be real, absolutely couldn't believe I was looking at a real Dogman. I'm not sure how to explain it better than that. It was the biggest surprise of my entire life. But the surprises were only getting started. So I was in the middle of changing my tire. I had the blown tire off, but I had not yet finished fastening the spare tire when I saw that Dogman. I immediately made eye contact and stood up in shock and awe and excitement. The Dogman didn't seem to take my sudden movements as a good thing, though, and he leaped into a defensive pose, snarling and baring his teeth, making himself appear even larger somehow through bodily postures he adapted. I got the awful sense that the Dogman was not understanding me. I wanted to observe him. I wanted to come to understand him. I wanted to be a part of his life. But by the angry look in the huge beast's eyes, he would have been more interested in slicing me up and making me part of a salad. When I've told this story to my few close friends, this is the point when they stop me and ask what exactly the creature looked like. After all, Dogman can mean different things to different people. In this case, I saw a monster with gray fur and a mainly humanoid body. It had dog's hind legs, but it had forelimbs that resembled human arms more than dog's front legs. I do not know if this was the kind of Dogman that can run on all fours as well as walk bipedally, as I only saw it walking and running upright in my experience. It looked as though walking upright was all that it did, but those hind legs were so canine, maybe it really was capable of moving either on 2 legs or 4. It had tall, pointed ears that were constantly in motion. They reminded me of radar towers reading sounds almost like how a bat's ears do. I knew it wasn't blind like a bat, though, because it had large eyes that glared at me with hatred, glowing in a yellowish white that I found blinding. When I would look away, I still saw spots and trails from where I had looked into those burning bright, fiery eyes. It was taller and wider than any human male I've ever seen. It was bigger than a linebacker, taller than a basketball player. It was covered in fur, but the fur was thicker in some areas and sparser in others. I don't know if that was natural or the result of some disease like mange, but it seemed fairly symmetrical, so I'm going to guess that the fur was supposed to look the way it did. The under fur was a grayish-bluish color, at least in the dim lighting, and I admit that did remind me of how a bear with mange's skin can sometimes look in photos I've seen. This was not a bear with mange, but I want to be honest about what I saw so that you can visualize it in your mind. Skeptics aren't going to believe me anyway. They'll call it a bear even if I say it had 3 eyes and a beak, which it didn't, but I'm just saying. So there I was, standing next to my tire that I hadn't really attached correctly, realizing that the Dogman I had waited a lifetime to meet hated me on sight. It was worse than meeting your favorite celebrity only to find out he's kind of a jerk. I mean, even if they yell at you, they're probably not going to tear you to ribbons like this guy might. I didn't know what to do, so I backed away. The Dogman walked toward me on his hind legs, looking perfectly balanced just as I knew he would. I made a break for the other side of the truck and got myself into the driver's seat, slamming and locking the door behind me. The Dogman was on me in a second, slamming big, meaty hands into the side of the truck shaking the entire vehicle with me inside it. I still had the truck up on the jack since I hadn't finished attaching the new wheel, but the Dogman soon had me knocked down off that jack. I realized that wheel might not hold for long, but I did have 4 wheels on the ground, and if I wanted to live to see another day, I should probably try to drive out of there before the Dogman broke in. The engine took a few tries to start, and in the meantime, the Dogman actually cracked my front windshield. I was crying as much because I thought I might die as I was because of the deep disappointment of finding out that the Dogman did not in any way see me as a kindred soul. The Dogman did not recognize our similarity. The Dogman instead saw me as something completely alien, something possibly threatening. He wanted to end my existence. He was so appalled by my mere presence. I hadn't done anything to this creature, but it loathed me. I drove away and watched the Dogman run after. I knew he was going to try to jump in my pickup bed in the back, so I had my foot down on the gas. The truck was driving wobbly because of the front tire, but I threw all my eggs into my Hail Mary pass. I was either going to get away on that wobbly tire, or I was going to get caught and sliced up by that Dogman. Well, I lived to tell you the story so you know what the ending was. The car made it home, but I somehow wrecked my front end by driving home crazy on that half-attached wheel the way I did. My buddy at the gas station asked me how I even did that. He said he'd never seen a car messed up in the way I'd messed up my truck. I had to get a new pickup, which my uncle helped me with, and it turned out not to be as traumatic and expensive as I thought it was going to be. I took a big shot to my pride that night, though. I had thought I was a wolf. I had thought I was a wild man. I thought I was the same as a Dogman. The Dogman, however, was apparently of a different opinion. It was humbling. It was unsettling. It was scary. And it was life-changing. I guess I learned that no matter how much admiration we might have for another creature, we need to accept ourselves for who we are. We can never be someone else, and we can't be another thing beside human, at least not in this lifetime. If you want to prove me wrong and explain how to shapeshift in the comments, I promise I'll read them, but until then, I'm going to accept myself as a human and nothing else. We can love nature all we want, but we can only ever be the part of nature that we were born to be. And as far as I know, that's a decision that's out of our hands. I almost lost my life, my human life, and it was all because I stupidly idolized the Dogman. I think my missing dog became a Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, the coolest dog I ever knew was a big black Labrador retriever that I named Big Ethel. When I say big, I mean big. When she was 1.5 years old, she would stand and put her paws over my shoulders. Then we would hug each other and she'd give me big, wet dog kisses. She was taller than I was when she stood up on her hind legs, but I was never once afraid of her. When Ethel was a puppy, I would let her sleep next to my bed, but before she was a full year old, she would ask to go outside all night instead. I built her a doghouse, and for a while, things were fine. I woke up one morning to find her missing, and that was a very sad morning. By the afternoon, she had come back, though, and that day I put in a chain and a collar attached to the corner of my house, and I would put the collar on her at night so that she couldn't run off like that any longer. Well, it was a leather collar, and that was my fatal error. I awoke one morning to find that the leather collar had been chewed through, and that my big Ethel was gone. I hoped she would come back during the day that day, as she had the last time, but it was not to be. She didn't come home the next day or the next, and I soon had to accept that she had left permanently. Years went by. I got a cat, who I keep indoors, but I didn't have the heart to try to replace Big Ethel. I guess I still hoped that she would come back one day, even though I knew it wasn't going to happen. Then, one evening, just as the sun was going down, I was out with the hose watering some of my plants that I've been told it's better to hydrate at night. You want the water to get soaked in before the sun comes up. The water acts like magnifying lenses and burns through some kinds of leaves and plants. At least, that's what the guy at the store told me, so I was out watering these plants at sundown. There was a strange sound approaching my backyard, or really a strange combination of sounds. It was as though a bunch of men were running with dogs in the direction of my backyard. I looked, confused, in the direction of the ever louder odd noises. Crash! I saw not one, not two, but 4 or 5 or 6 upright running dog-headed furry animals with insanely panicked expressions on their dog faces. I screamed and tripped over my hose. Then I got up to run back to the house. As I did so, I looked over my shoulder to ensure that I wasn't being chased. It was then that I saw a very large, black, female dog running on her hind legs after the others. My mind clicked, and my heart exploded. "Ethel!" I shouted in stunned surprise. She slid to a halt, looked at me, cocked her head to the side as though trying to remember. Then, off in the woods, she heard the others barking and she left to join them. They were either chasing some prey, or they were playing. But she was now part of a group. A group of what? To me, they didn't look like wolves. They looked like one German Shepherd and one Golden Retriever, and of course Ethel was a Labrador. I can't remember what the other 1 or 2 or 3 looked like. It all happened so fast. My point, though, is that I don't recall any of them looking like they were originally a wild animal. They all seemed to be former house pets or the descendants of house pets. Yet, they were all racing around bipedally, including my Ethel, if that really is who I saw that evening. Nothing about any of this really makes much sense to me. I can't explain to you how this happened, or even what exactly happened. I know if I ask an expert on animals or nature, they'll just have me committed to an institution. Unless or until other people start reporting seeing what I saw, I'm only going to report it anonymously. Maybe it's possible that one of the dogmen I saw was a real one, an original dogman. Maybe somehow he or she has taken these 4-legged ordinary dogs and, I don't know, evolved them? I know that what I just said makes no sense, but I'm just tossing out ideas. If one of the bipedal upright canines I saw racing crazily past me that night were really a wolf, I didn't notice it. Here's another idea. What if their leader is a skinwalker, or werewolf, or shapeshifter? What if their leader possesses human or some other kind of intelligence? Could that explain how he or she has built this tribe around him or herself? I know that my dog disappeared, and I know I saw a pack of upright canines running past one corner of my property. I don't know for certain if that was Ethel I saw, or if these 2 incidents are even related. And yet, I'm still left here saying, I think my missing dog became a dogman. The Dogman of Wolfman Lane. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I want to tell you a story about a stupid thing that my friends and I did one Halloween long ago. It wasn't anything malicious, but it was inconsiderate, and I know we wouldn't do it again. And that's because we had the living daylights scared out of us by the Dogman of Wolfman Lane. This story started as we were home watching our house while our parents were away on vacation. I had some friends over, and my sister had some of hers over as well. I guess I was 21 back then, and she was 19 going on 20. I think one or two people went home, and so four of us decided to go look at a place called Wolfman Lane. I don't want to say where it is because I don't want any of you bothering the nice people who live there, and I also don't want any of you running into the same creature that we ran into. So this had started as a dare between two of the girls. I think they were just joking about it, but the guys took it up, and before you knew it, there we were driving silently down a dark row of family homes, and so forth, way after midnight. I believe we had aimed to arrive there at 3 a.m. to make it spookier, although we had all been in a great mood, laughing and joking on the way over. Once we were there, in the dark, feeling stupid, we were all silent. I was probably more afraid that one of the homeowners was going to come out of his house and hold a rifle to our heads than I was of seeing a wolfman on Wolfman Lane, but it was a genuinely creepy experience. We all decided at once that we wanted to leave, and whoever's car it was immediately began making a U-turn. And just as he got ready to peel out, we all heard a dog barking behind us. But I mean a big dog. I turned around and began screaming at the driver to drive. There was a hairy, man-like thing chasing us, and it had a dog's head. It looked insane in the light given off by the rear of that car. Its pupils seemed completely dilated, and it seemed to be able to open its jaws as wide as the extinct thylacine is shown doing in old films. It was maybe tan or maybe brown, and it was as tall as a very tall man. We sped out of there, and after about a half a block, the werewolf gave up the chase. Or maybe it was a dogman, as I did not see it wearing clothing or seeming human in any way, other than its bipedal locomotion. None of us thought it was a man in a costume, although when we tell the story, people often smirk and insist it was a prank pulled on us by the people who live on that block. After all, it was around Halloween, and I'm sure that we weren't the first geniuses brilliant enough to dare each other to go drive there in the middle of the night. That is the most popular theory to explain what happened to us. I believe this theory contains holes, though. First of all, nobody who was there that night thought that we were seeing a man in a costume. That's always laughed off by saying that we were scared, and we imagined seeing more than what was there because we were primed to be frightened. Maybe so, but those legs looked like real wolf legs to me. They did not look like human legs. That jaw sure looked real. The teeth, the tongue, they seemed quite alive, not like parts of a costume. I probably got the best view of anyone, and that was a living being chasing us. It was not a costumed man. It absolutely could not have been. The other big hole in the theory that this was a guy wearing a costume is that there would have to be that guy in a costume actually there out in the cold on guard all night, just in case some dumb young people like us drove down the street looking for a Dogman sighting. I mean, can it really happen that often that this is called for? Where would the poor guy sleep? Is he sleeping in the werewolf costume? Did we trip an alarm when we turned onto the block so he got up, brushed his Dogman teeth, and then ran out onto the street to scare us away? Or maybe did the people who live there get so sick of werewolf tourism that instead of hiring a security guard to keep the people away, they went ahead and hired themselves a werewolf? Stop me if I start making sense, because I'm only confusing myself. I would rather allow this to remain a mystery than to go back to that area uninvited. It was very thoughtless of us to go there in the first place, Although we meant no harm, I do not want to go back there. I don't want to ask the people who live there any intrusive questions. If they really hired a dogman or a guy in a werewolf costume, then that means they want their space. And if that is not the explanation, then that means there must be a genuine dogman over there. In either case, I'd say leave the place alone. Unless you have actual business being there, then just don't go anywhere near. I don't want to lecture, but be careful when you dare your friends and go legend tripping. You want to make sure that you don't run into the Dogman of Wolfman Lane. Welcome, my friends, to the place to be. Our executive producer is named Chris C. He's on the $3 level. That's the way that it is, because you know I'm talking about Chris. Please join me in thanking Chris C., our newest channel member. Chris gets to see our secret Sunday Uncensored stories, plus he has access to our archives of over 10 hours of scary, uncensored Dogman stories far too wild to tell on this channel. You can join too just by clicking the join link under this or any video. And now, for the scariest story I've heard in a really long time. This one gave me the creeps, and we call it The House Where Nightmares Are Born. Dear Scary Stories NYC, there is a house. It is an actual house, and I hope eventually to be able to give you all the exact address of this real home. Right now, it is still owned by a man who I am trying to buy it from, and it's looking like the project may take months or years before bearing fruit. I found out about this place in the strangest of ways. I didn't discover it through a real estate agent. I didn't find it from a listing. I found it because of my Dogman sighting. My first Dogman sighting, I should say. Can you imagine seeing an actual Dogman, a 6 or 7 foot tall bipedal dog, racing across the trail you're walking on in the late afternoon woods? I was in a bit of a rush to get back to the parking lot before dark. I had driven to a particular natural area in a certain American state in order to hike, breathe fresh air, feel some sun on myself, and get a little exercise. All of that happened, but then I got a cryptid sighting tossed in for free. As you can imagine, at the time, I thought that seeing a Dogman at less than 100 feet was probably the most incredible thing that was ever going to happen to me. Time would prove me wrong about that, however. The most incredible thing was not that upright canine I was marveling at. It was where that canine was heading. That was what would have the biggest impact on me personally. As frightening as a Dogman can be, and as dangerous as they seem to be as well, the Dogman is not on the same level as that house. You'll see what I mean in time, but first, let me tell you about my Dogman sighting. I did not hear the creature coming, and part of that would be because I am not an expert hiker. Even so, with all my huffing and puffing, I should have noticed that monster before I did. Suddenly, I heard it in front of me, and I looked up to see it already past the trail I was on, sprinting into the woods to my right as fast as anything on 2 legs could possibly run. It was not a man. I know the sighting happened quickly, but it was not a man. I know the sighting happened at dusk, but it was not a man. It had a dog's head. It had dog's legs. and it was just not a human being. Now, because of the sun going down, I cannot tell you the exact coloring of the thing, but it was darker colored. It was a type of dog like a Doberman, but a shaggy Doberman. It might have been colored black or gray or brown, but it was darkly colored in any case. I remember not thinking. I remember realizing that I was running after it, and I remember realizing that I had my jaw hanging wide open, and my eyes as well. I remember that I could swear that I saw it head into a house there in the woods. Why was there a house in the woods near the parking lot in that park? I had never noticed it there before. Then I remembered that I was in a rush and I skedaddled out of there, getting in the car and heading home. I told my girlfriend about my sighting and she laughed at me. It's not that she doesn't accept the possibility of the existence of cryptids. It's just that she doesn't accept the existence of houses on government parkland that Dogman lives inside of. Especially since she'd hiked that same trail a few times before she met me, and she never noticed a house where I described this one being. So eventually we scheduled a day to hike that trail together, and also to look for the house that I mentioned. It was not there. I mean, it wasn't there at all. There was no sign of a house having ever been there. So we hiked until we knew we needed to head back, and once again it was around dusk as we drew near to the parking lot. I was about to tell my girlfriend that this was where I saw the Dogman when a huge white canine barreled out of the woods to our left and charged past us into the woods on our right. It ran on all fours and it had a long tail, but then it rose back and leaped over a bush the way a decathlon athlete might, on its hind legs. I ran after it, wanting to see if it was going to the house, and there it was, the house I had seen the previous time. Old, yet not quite abandoned looking. I said, "Let's go," to my girlfriend, then noticed she was not with me. She was still back on the trail. I ran to her, telling her about the house in the woods. She nodded and pointed into the trees, mentioning that the house had a light in the window. Then she turned and walked quickly and rigidly toward the parking lot. I wasn't going into that house alone, so we both drove home in absolute, unbroken silence. I knew better than to even bring up the subject to her, and it took 4 days before she brought it up with me. And even then, it was to tell me never to go back there to that park. I had to admit I'd already gone back twice, and I hadn't seen the house either time. She didn't want to hear more, so I started confiding in my buddy, who we can call Trevor. He came up with what I call the Trevor theory. Basically, Trevor thought that house only existed certain times of the day, or at least it only became accessible to us in our reality at dusk, or maybe at both dusk and dawn, or maybe all night, since I'd never actually been there all night. Maybe it's there all the time, but only visible during the darker hours. So we began testing our theory. His theory. And guess what? It was definitely there the last time we visited the place at sundown. We walked over to the house itself, and we were able to see inside the window of a first-floor room. It appeared as though someone lived there, as the table light was on, and there was a comfortable chair with a newspaper on it. I didn't see the date on the paper, but it did not appear yellowed. It seemed recent. I noticed a bookshelf with books on it, mostly paperbacks, and some old framed pictures on the walls. I didn't notice a television, a computer, a radio, or really any electrical device other than the table lamp. Trevor called to me to come around the side. He showed me a row of 3 windows at the bottom of the wall, revealing a basement level under the main floor. There was something weird going on down there, under these dim, greenish, flickering lights. I leaned in closer and closer, seeing but not understanding what I was seeing. There was constant movement down there, but I didn't understand what the movement was. Trevor said, "That's larva." I looked again, and then that was what it looked like. Very, very large larva, like human-sized larva, all squirming over and under each other, filling up the entire basement. I was about to say that it reminded me of Invasion of the Body Snatchers when a man's voice barked at us, "Hey, what are you guys doing? This is private property." We ran out of there like two kids caught with our hands in the cookie jar. Still, there was something familiar about that voice, and so I turned around to look. It was him. It was Leonard Nimoy. I stopped and smiled and called to Trevor, who stopped as well. We both gawked in amazement, seeing Leonard Nimoy himself out there at that strange house in the woods. My head spun in confusion. I think I might have even taken a step toward Mr. Nimoy to tell him what a fan I was. But then Trevor grabbed me and pulled me away. It dawned on me why. That was the way Leonard Nimoy had looked in the 1970s. When this story happened, the beloved actor had already passed away. In other words, that wasn't Leonard Nimoy. In the 70s, they made a remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers that co-starred Leonard Nimoy, Mr. Spock from Star Trek. Right after I thought that the giant larvae in that basement reminded me of the pods in that movie, we both saw Leonard Nimoy. It was kind of like Mars is Heaven by Ray Bradbury. The pods in Body Snatchers were used to replace human beings with versions of themselves that were evil and controlled by a hive mind. That's sort of what I'm thinking happens at that house, but not exactly. I think the larvae either transform or maybe just appear to us to be taking on the form of something that was in our mind immediately before their appearance. Rather than me and my girlfriend seeing a dogman, maybe one of the larvae, returning home to the house at dusk, briefly took on the appearance of a dogman, since that was what I was thinking about just before it appeared. Of course, it looked very different from the first dogman I saw, and I don't remember thinking about dogmen or werewolves before that sighting. My theory is far from perfect, but it's my working hypothesis. Getting away to the parking lot, we hatched a plan to research the property and find out what history it had, if any. We were stunned to discover that it was not actually a part of the state park at all. The parking lot was in fact built on private land that is leased by the state so that people can access the state-owned park. The only thing I can say is everything about this place confuses me up to and including the parking lot. When we were finally able to discover and locate the owner of the lot and the house property, he had first appeared glad to sell it to me at any price I named. When Trevor made the foolish decision to refer to the house on the property, though, the current owner went silent and cold on us. That was the end of negotiations for a long time, but we've been able to revive it lately by removing Trevor from the situation. He's a good guy, but he's got a big mouth. The owner seems very suspicious of me since old Trev made his little slip, and I have to say I wonder why. I wonder what he knows. Does he know more than we do? Or is he just spooked by the place and afraid of us because we've heard of it? Maybe he's afraid that we know more than he does. I know that if word leaks out about this location, the guy will never sell, so I've probably already said too much. I will do my best to get the place for my own so that I can invite in experts who can figure out what this place is, why it isn't always there, and whether or not it represents any actual threat to people who may be in the area. Until then, that's about all I can tell you about the house where nightmares are born. I saw a dogman on an island Dear Scary Stories NYC, I saw Dogman on an island. It's a sort of a famous island, at least around here, because it has an old lighthouse on it that dates back to the 1800s. It's electric and automatic now, and the lighthouse itself had to be shored up years ago to keep it from falling down, but essentially it's still the same lighthouse that's been on the island since long before anyone on the earth living today was ever born. I respect old things and I'm interested in them. Sure, I get curious in the normal ways and I read up on subjects that pique my interest, but I also sometimes just enjoy appreciating things. I've been all around the planet Earth, first when I was in the service and then because my late wife was a lover of travel. I tell you that on all the planet, I've never found any place lovelier than the United States of America. I'm particularly in love with Wisconsin, possibly just because, well, I was born here. I'm very proud to be from Wisconsin, and that's kind of how this story starts. I was out on Canine Island at night when it's dark, when you aren't supposed to be there. I had no bad intentions, however. I just wanted to appreciate the lighthouse and the island at night. Why? Because nobody ever does that anymore. People, families lived there for so many decades, for over a century. Now the only people who see the light at night are in boats going past it. And so I stood there on that late summer or early autumn night, breathing in the sea air and feeling as though I were time traveling to when that lighthouse was new. It was about the most romantic thing I could do that didn't involve the full moon and a lovely companion. Romantic, in the other sense at least. Like being in a fantasy novel, but a quiet, peaceful scene. And then, in the next second, I saw something that ripped me out of that fantasy novel and threw me headlong and clumsily into a particularly creepy horror movie. There was this creature walking through the mist or fog on the other side of the island. The first words that popped into my mind as I saw it were, "Witch wolf." I don't know where that term came from or if I made it up myself, but it looked like an animal, a dog-like or wolf-like animal that was walking upright with very large clawed hands held out in front of it. The animal appeared more intelligent than a normal animal, but that might be me projecting. I can't tell. It just exuded intelligence. It did not seem like a bear or a giant coyote. The main thing I remember about it were those ridiculously, nightmarishly long claws, like curved daggers at the ends of his fingers. He dangled and twitched them around, all independently of each other. I cannot emphasize enough that this dog-headed beast man seemed to have walked directly out of a nightmare. It did not look natural, and yet there it was moving across the island, and so it must have been real. It was not a ghost, I don't think. It looked like it was heading somewhere that it needed to get fast, and it ducked behind the lighthouse. I took that as my cue to get a little wet heading back to the mainland. Now, the first question to many of you, I'm sure, is, how did a dogman get on an island? Well, to be honest, Canine Island is sort of connected to mainland Wisconsin, at least during low tide. So the dogman doesn't have to have swam there, or swum there. He could have walked. The next logical question is, where did he walk from? I can't answer that, obviously, as the dogman never confided in me about that subject. But I do know that Bailey's Harbor Boreal Forest and Wetlands is nearby to the north, and the Moonlight Bay Bedrock Beach State Natural Area is located just to the west. If we're assuming the Dogman is some kind of real, living, predatory carnivore or scavenger, those are two possible locations he might have come on over from. Did the Dogman's eyes glow? Yes, they did seem lit from within, but that might have been a trick of the eyes since it was such a misty or foggy night. Have I ever been back to Canna Island? No, I most definitely have not. Would I go back? Maybe, if I got paid to. I'm afraid I'd rather only visit the island again during an official tour or some such thing. And, of course, obviously I'd only want to go during the day. And that's because I saw Dogman on an island. Charles Hill likes to chill, more hydropower than a water mill. As executive producer, he fits the bill, like sunlight on your windowsill. Please join us in thanking our newest channel member, Charles Hill, as he helped make this episode possible to create. Join Mr. Hill, who fits the bill, as a channel member, and you will get to see our secret, uncensored, scary stories, way too crazy to play on this channel, each Sunday night. And speaking of Dogman stories, we've got 2 more today. This first one is especially scary, and we call it The Dogman of the Louisiana Swamps. Dear Scary Stories NYC, have you ever been out in the open and noticed that you were being stalked? This is what happened to me in my youth as I wandered at dusk in a place not meant for humans to go. As I walked home on that creepy night, I got stalked by the Dogman of the Louisiana Swamps. I grew up in and around New Orleans, so I knew the legends of the loup-garou and the werewolves that are supposed to live in that region. The way it had been told in my family, though, was that these werewolves did not turn back into men like in the movies. These loup-garou, according to my mother, were full-time werewolves. They lived in nature like animals. They did not speak or wear clothes or act like humans in any other way other than their curious predilection to walking upright on their hind legs the way we do. I never doubted that the loup-garou were real. My Uncle Charlie told me that he saw one just outside of New Orleans one night, and that was the last night he ever drank a drop of the booze. He quit right then and there. That's how much this sighting freaked him out. My personal experience was the most unsettling thing that ever happened to me. I was afraid for my life before I even knew it was the Dogman. I was walking back from the Shell Beach area, where they have the Katrina Memorial nowadays. I had just gotten broken up with by my first serious girlfriend. I thought things were fine between us, so the intensity of the breakup took me completely by surprise. She was so insulting, so hurtful, that I felt like I'd been beaten up. I had no defense, as I had no warning this was about to happen. She even threatened to send her big brothers after me, which was completely uncalled for, since I hadn't even said anything since she started screaming at me. She told me that if I ever came to her part of town, she'd have her brothers take care of me. She might send them after me anyway, just so that I would know that she meant business. I still, to this day, don't understand her animosity or what exactly I had done to earn this treatment. And at the time, I was completely devastated. Even with the threat of her big brothers looming over me, I found it hard to concentrate enough to walk home for several hours. I had been dumped in the afternoon, and by dusk, I was realizing that I had been walking in circles. That woke me up a bit, because if I hadn't left her part of town, then I might get spotted by her or her brothers. I remember I was crying, and that it was hard to see which way I was going. I also couldn't remember east, west, north, or south. That's how badly battered my brains were at that point on that evening. But I did eventually find myself on Citrus Avenue in St. Bernard, Louisiana. There's all that swampland over there. It looks kind of like grass from the road. It looks like a field. But I've been told that you want to stay on Citrus Avenue pretty much. You can walk off the road and come across snakes and supposedly sometimes gators. The land can appear dry. Then you take one more step and get dunked into a 20 or 30-foot pool of water. They've also got this kind of land that's neither dirt nor water. What do they call it again? Oh yeah, quicksand. Now, I never myself ever wandered off of Citrus Avenue, so those might just be stories I told you. But I've heard the stories more than once, so I believe them. On that night, in my depths of sorrow and self-pity, I thought I caught sight of someone walking out in the swamps to the side of me. It took me some time to stop my eyes from tearing, and some more time before I could start to focus on things at a distance. But it sure did look like a man out there in the swamp. That would be crazy to walk out there when the road was here. I got scared for whoever it was, and then I noticed how tall they would have had to be for me to be seeing as much of them as I was. That girl who just dumped me, her brothers were extremely tall. Could that be one of her brothers? I stared out into the swamp, trying to make out who that was and if they looked at all familiar. Whoever it was, they were making better time in the swamp than I was making on the well-traveled road. That made no sense. It must be a Superman out there. And then, that Superman, whether it was my ex-girlfriend's brother or not, turned to begin trudging through the swamp toward me. I ran. I ran until I realized I can't run very far, and then I stopped and I coughed violently and I gasped for air. I had been over my asthma for years already by then, but I was still not exactly an athlete. I decided to walk quickly rather than run. It wasn't as fast, but I could do it for longer without resting. Slow and steady win the race, I told myself, and then I looked over my shoulder to see if I was getting away from my ex's brother. I learned 2 things with that one glance. First of all, I was not getting away, because the figure was now far closer to me. Second of all, that was not one of my ex-girlfriend's brothers. I know this for a fact, because none of her brothers has a canine head equipped with oversized monster teeth. This time, I ran, and I got exhausted, but I just kept going. I came across a house on the right, and I ran up to it, ringing the doorbell like I was playing a pinball machine. I turned and saw the Dogman climb up out of the swamp area and stand next to the road staring at me. Its eyes glowed in the early evening like lightning bugs, and its head was covered in a light orange or tan-colored fur. The rest of it was dark and wet, and I could tell that it had been submerged in all kinds of water, dirt, and mud, right up to its neck. I do not remember arms or legs clearly, although I do think the arms must have been human or ape-like to some extent at least. I was mainly seeing those glowing eyes and the massive teeth. I also did not notice if it had human legs or dog legs either, I'm afraid. I watched as it seemed to consider stepping up onto the road or not. As the family who lived in that house opened the door and I tried to explain my predicament while gasping to catch my breath, I looked and saw the Dogman calmly turn around and just start walking back out into the swamp. I want to make that last point clear. It walked into a swamp, not a forest. I pointed it out and the family all came out to watch it walk away. They said they'd seen them before, but that was the largest one ever. The father drove me home even though I was a total stranger. That's what people used to be like in the old days. So, that creepy ex-girlfriend and her brothers tried to mess with me a little in school, but it never got past words. and soon they moved on. She was definitely not worth fighting over, and I wasn't half as afraid of those brothers anymore. Not since I'd escaped being stalked by the Dogman of the Louisiana swamps. Did I see a levitating Dogman? Dear Scary Stories NYC, my brother and I both saw something when we were kids that, thinking back on it, might have been a Dogman. But if it was, then it was a levitating Dogman. The town I grew up in is named Fall River, Kansas. It's named after an actual river that defines the northwest edge of the place. That's where my brother and I used to go to play a lot, in the woods between people's homes and the Fall River on the north side. Sometimes we'd run into our friends or enemies there, but a lot of the time we'd have it to ourselves. And then, that one evening, we ran into that flying man with the dog head. It looked like it would have been taller than my father if it were standing on the ground, which of course it wasn't. It was up in the air over the river, and it had some kind of device strapped to its back. At first, I thought it was just a large dog as I saw it hovering there in profile. It seemed to be dangling there limp, being held up by its shoulders or armpits by the thing on its back. It sounded like a helicopter, sort of, but I didn't see the blade over it. Still, I think the device that held him up must have been some sort of early drone type thing. This was in the late 1970s, and we had not heard of such technology, so to us, it looked like he was being held up by an anti-gravity backpack. I haven't been back to Fall River in many, many years, but at least back then, the roads were sometimes not even paved, and we had no sidewalks. It was a rural place, even though we had other families living right next door to us all around. And if you walk past town, you'd find farmland in all directions. It was not a place where science fiction kinds of things happened. Maybe over in a big city like Wichita, but not in our little place. My family never owned a color TV. It was not like today with cell phones and all that streaming brown from Hollywood and so forth. So when we saw the big dog in the air, we understood that it was technology holding him up there. But we did not comprehend what that technology was. I mean, honestly, I still don't. I'm just thinking that because I heard whirring blades like a chopper, that it might have been an early drone. So, I hear some of you ask, why not assume it was some kind of 1970s mad scientist out checking his drone jetpack on his pet dog? Why not assume it was remotely controlled by someone on the ground that we couldn't see and just leave it at that? Well, something happened that, to me at least, indicates that the dog had to have had intelligence. And if it had intelligence, then that was not just a flying dog. That would then make it a flying dog man. What happened was basically just that the dog man caught sight of us, and he turned his head and began barking furiously at us. I know any dog would do that. That's not a display of intelligence beyond the normal canine kind. I know. But it was what happened next that I'm really talking about. The dog's head was turned toward us, barking, as I said, but then his entire body made a right turn in our direction. He began floating toward us, and it was clear that he was somehow directing or guiding the direction that his backpack device was taking him in. One person I told this story to recently said that whoever was flying the dog from below simply turned the device to fly in the direction that the dog was looking in and barking. But why would they do that? There were no cameras apparent on the Dogman or the device carrying him through the air. Unless they could see through the eyes of the dog itself, then they couldn't have known what he was seeing. I mean, to me, the hypothesis of it being some person on the ground somewhere becomes harder and harder to believe the more you look into it. The technology required would have to have been so advanced that it couldn't have happened in the 70s or even the 80s or 90s for that matter. It reaches the point where you have to wonder if the Dogman were being flown by people from the future or from another planet. And if you're going to go there, then why not just consider the possibility that this was an intelligent canine and not an ordinary one? People ask me, did the creature do anything physically to demonstrate that it was a Dogman and not an ordinary dog? Other than the act of turning his device or vehicle toward us, the answer is no. It just looked like a big, muscular, massive dog hanging there limp, held aloft by the straps under his armpits, binding him to the flying device. Like a Marmaduke kind of dog, like Scooby-Doo with muscles, really big. And when it hung there by its shoulders like that, it truly resembled a man floating in the air. A giant man, with a dog head. I remember us running out of the woods onto Elm Street and running down toward Traders Avenue, thinking that the dog was chasing us. Talk about a nightmare on Elm Street. I could hear him barking at us, and I could hear the barks echoing, but they kept sounding further and further away until we slowed down to catch our breath. You would think that we'd shy away from playing over by the Fall River for a while after that, but you'd be wrong. This was the 1970s, man. We had nothing to do. So, the next evening, we went back with a bunch of our other friends. For a week or two, it became a thing to do around dusk. Some nights, the grown-ups would even come by too, all hoping to catch a glimpse of the angry, barking, flying Dogman. It was a fun, nightly gathering for some of us, but like I said, when that Dogman never came back, people started forgetting about it, and then life just moved on. There was never a second sighting that I heard of, so it just became part of the past pretty quickly. I've had a lot of free time lately while I've been laid off, and I've been listening to Dogman stories on the internet. I now think that's what this was. I contacted my brother. He insists that it was not a Dogman, but an ordinary flying dog, and he doesn't want me to use our names in telling this. He's more successful than I am, and he has a lot more to lose. He also says that he saw a chopper blade above the flying dog, which is amazing because he never told me that before. So, even though he insists it was just a large dog and not a Dogman, he also claims now that it had a helicopter blade chopping away over its dog head. To me, this makes the whole story even stranger. Now I feel even more confused about what we might have seen there at the river that evening. I feel no closer to being able to answer the question, did I see a levitating Dogman? Dogman and the Wooden Bridge. Dear Scary Stories NYC, there's a wooden bridge down the block from the country house my mother lives in. It's where I grew up. My older brother, who left us when he was only 22, used to tease me that it was a troll bridge as opposed to a toll bridge. He said a troll used to live under it, and that every 123rd person who crossed overhead would get eaten by the troll. That was the toll of the troll, you see. My brother was very clever, and I tended to miss that I was being kidded. I used to believe all these wild stories he would tell me, and I grew up in a world of magic and fairies and trolls under the bridge down the block. I had occasion to go back home and stay with my mother for the first 3.5 months of this virus situation this year. Once settled in, I began to walk around to do the chores whenever driving could be avoided. There was a general store in town allowed to be open that we could get 85-90% of our supplies from, and I enjoyed the walk there and back. I'm also big about trying to spend our cash inside the community because I hope there will continue to be a community there of locally owned businesses. The path I took going home just after dark one night took me over toward the wooden bridge. This is not a covered wooden bridge, it's just a walking bridge made of wood. It was built a long time ago, and it's kind of a neat thing. On that night, though, I got a weird feeling in my belly that I should have chosen a different route home. All I could think about was my late brother telling me about the troll. What if I'm the 123rd traveler to cross it? How would I know? I tried to banish the silly childish thoughts, but I had already thought them, and the closer I drew to the bridge, the more unstable I felt inside. I practically knew something was about to happen, and I also felt as though it were my own fear and worry that was bringing my worst nightmare into reality. I looked around, hoping I would see anybody that I knew out in the evening, maybe walking their dog. At that point, I might have chatted up a complete stranger just to feel a little less alone. Instead of warming chatter, however, I was greeted by a cold wind, going straight up my pants leg to cool off my boxers while whistling in my ear, loud enough to hurt my eardrum. There was nobody there except me, the bridge, the cold wind, and of course, the troll that lives under that bridge. And as I stepped toward it, I saw it. I saw the immense troll beast, and I froze in my tracks. I have to be honest, it felt like a dream state. It looked real, and it smelled real, and it sounded real, but it felt like I was in bed, dreaming. The troll had a dog head, and a body like a primitive devil. It had hooked legs like they paint the devil having in old paintings. It had hair on its head, shoulders, then waist down like a fawn from ancient mythology. But fawns didn't have dog heads in the images I've seen. So maybe this was a dogman with mange. In this context, however, I knew that it was appearing to me as the troll from the mythology invented by my older brother when we were both young. Either he had tapped into something real about that bridge, or else his and my imaginations had combined with the bridge to make his vision come real before me. At least, that's what I was thinking about it then. I've also had it suggested to me that I was hallucinating, and that my subconscious association of the bridge with my brother's mythology caused my hallucination to take on the appearance that it did. I sometimes believe each of those theories, but I keep jumping back and forth and entertaining new ideas as well. I now think that trolls and ogres and creatures of that sort may very well have been dogmen or Bigfoot. I think that the context people witness cryptids and strange entities in helps dictate how they will interpret what they are seeing. In my case, I still refer to what I saw as a troll, and I still call that wooden construction the Troll Bridge. I know what I saw was a dogman, but in that context, to me, it was the troll of the bridge. I was the 123rd one to be about to cross it, and I was going to have to pay the toll. Heck, I was going to have to be the toll. Obviously, I was not going to take a step onto the bridge with the dog troll thing waiting on the other side glaring at me. I was going to have to walk back about 6 minutes and then come around home using the next street over. I backed away from the bridge slowly, hoping that the creature would stay on its side if I acted calm and didn't make any sudden movements. It was then that I nearly stepped on a rat. My mother calls them voles, but this one was so large, I'm calling it a rat. Realizing it at the last second, I did a little jig, hoping that the blind thing would keep running and get out of the scene. That rodent was more frightened than I was, as it clearly couldn't see that well and didn't understand what was happening. It ran up onto the top of one of my shoes and I freaked out, swinging my foot in a kicking motion that might have gotten me hired by professional football. That rat went flying, landing with a scrabbling sound on the wooden troll bridge and madly running forward, making it to land on the other side unhurt, but little stunned. The Dogman troll had stopped looking at me and was now looking down at the rat, or vole, walking toward him. It was then that the most shocking aspect of the entire experience happened. Both the Dogman and the rodent kind of grew liquidy looking, then melted down out of existence in front of my eyes. Nothing else about the scene seemed to change, only the two of them liquefying and melting out of this reality. I ran to the bridge, then stopped short, afraid to take a step onto it. Things seemed normal again, though. That sense of a waking dream was gone. And so, I ran across the bridge to look at the spots I saw the two animals melt away. There were no puddles there. I don't think they literally liquefied in that moment. I think they just went to another kind of a place. I was confused, and I was freaked out being alone in that spooky place in the night, so I held my groceries tight to my chest, and I walked as fast as I could the rest of the way home. It was only after I locked myself inside and felt safe again that the story began to make a little bit of sense to me. I could see the Dogman, the troll, because I was about to be the 123rd one to cross the bridge since the last time he had collected his toll. But then, I accidentally kicked that rat onto the bridge, changing destiny and causing the troll to have to accept the rat as his toll instead of me. I was the 124th traveler to cross, or I guess I was number 1 on the new count that began after the rat. I almost told one of my friends about this story, and I almost told my mother too. The thing is, before I can tell the story, I have to explain my late brother's mythology. And when I go over that in my head, planning out what I might say, I can't imagine my mother or my friends thinking that the jokes my brother made when he was a teenager are actually the living mythology I personally see them as. I feel like they might feel uncomfortable and wonder if I'm losing my sanity. So, for now, let's keep it between you and me, all this stuff I told you about. Dogman and the wooden bridge. Our executive producer is named Kyle. He's a brand new member, and that makes me smile. I'm happier than if I won 12 rondos, because our new EP is Kyle Ramondos. Kyle Ramondos joined us at our all-new 99-cent level, which allows him to see our secret uncensored scary stories each Sunday. That's right, Henry. You can also join at higher levels and gain access to our 10 hours of archived uncensored stories, or even watch the episodes before everyone else by becoming a $10 member. Just click the join link under this video to find out more. You said it, Biggie. And now it's time for another all-new scary Dogman story. You know, this one freaks me out personally, and we call it I Saw Dogman Hypnotize My Sister. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I am a former hypnotist, and I do believe that I witnessed an actual Dogman perform a kind of natural hypnosis on my own sister. I'll explain a little about my background, explain what I saw that I think was the Dogman, and what I saw him do. I'll also go into what the apparent result was on my sister. She also told me about another incident that happened when I was not there, which may or may not be related. First of all, I was never a stage hypnotist. I hung out my shingle back in the 1980s as someone who could cure smoking and some other bad habits that people were looking to kick back in those days. I did well enough that it paid my rent, and I had a lot of free time. I socialized. I found a girlfriend, and just lucked out when it turned out that she is a whiz both at the stock market and real estate. We were too late to the crypto thing, but we are set up well enough. that I stopped taking new hypnosis clients over 15 years ago. I still do hypnotize people from time to time, as I have old clients from back in the day who still come by a few times a year. My point is that I understand the subject of hypnosis, and I often recognize when other people, or even media, are trying to do the same or a similar thing. That having been said, I never considered the idea that animals may hypnotize their prey, or possibly sometimes mesmerize their attacker, so that they can get away. I now suspect that the basic principles may be at use daily in the natural world all around us, and we just haven't had the eyes to see it. I had not seen my sister in person since the 20th century, when my wife and I went to stay with her and her family at the start of the pandemic lockdowns. It was very strange to be with her, but she was quite welcoming. By the second week, we had taken to walking around the edge of the property in the evening just before dinner time. We would talk about the old days, and also about what our lives had been like since we were last together. One night, when it was her turn to talk, she made a motion with her hand and said casually that this was where she had seen the Dogman that time. I was like, "Say that again?" But I had heard her correctly. She calmly told me that a 7-foot-tall, pitch-black canine with headlights instead of eyes strolled out of the woods right from that direction, stopped in front of her, and stared at her. I started laughing out of nervousness, and she laughed too, then returned to walking. I asked her to wait, and pleaded with her to fill in more details about the Dogman, and the headlights, and all that sort of thing. She shrugged her shoulders and said, "You tell me." I asked her what happened then, what happened after the big Dogman blocked her path. She looked confused by the question. I recognized, or I thought I recognized, that her memories had been somehow blocked. She only seemed to remember part of the story, and her emotions seemed deeply suppressed on the subject as well. I felt that either she never actually saw a Dogman, and that was a cover memory for something even wilder, or the Dogman had used some kind of hypnosis on her. Needless to say, this was all quite unexpected for me. I didn't think Dogman was even that big a thing before this happened. A simple Google search proved me wrong on that score. I haven't read much about Dogman having hypnotic powers, but I have read and heard people describing an unnatural kind of fear when the creatures were around. It's possible that might be a description of a hypnotic effect. So I had a lot to think about, and very little information to go on. My sister didn't really want to talk about it. She probably had been commanded not to. That was another issue. How could a Dogman or any non-human creature hypnotize a human being? Wouldn't you need to speak our language? And do it in a soothing and boring way? Even if it were possible for the Dogman to speak, I'm sure the sound of it would be most alarming, and therefore ineffective for calming a mind down into hypnosis. Before we go any further, I would like to point out a simple fact that almost nobody realizes. Most of us are hypnotized most of the time. If you say "not me," then I say "yes you," and I mean it too. If you want to understand more, it's a subject that has become easy to research and learn about. There are all different ways and means one can use to hypnotize, and I'm not going to explain any of them to you at all. Well, except for the method I think I saw the Dogman do on my sister. It wasn't the next night, but a few nights later, when my sister and I were walking around the property, we came upon that same batch of trees where she had blurted out that she had seen the Dogman a few nights before. I was about to make mention of exactly that when I noticed my sister suddenly wandering off the path to my right. She seemed to be going into the woods, and I began to follow until I saw what was happening. The freakiest looking thing I had ever seen was standing behind some trees and bushes. It looked as weird as a man wearing a bear costume, but it was definitely a real living being. It's just that it was a real alive animal or person that looked to me to be as alien and out of place as a man wearing a bear costume would have been in that context. It was as unnerving to see him there as it was frightening. I wasn't just afraid because this looked like a dangerous animal. I also felt a deep terror deriving from the fact that this was clearly not something that was supposed to exist. I don't only mean that werewolves aren't supposed to be real. I also mean that the way it moved and breathed and blinked its eyes and walked were different from how they were supposed to look. It was as if physics were different for it than for anything else on Earth. I don't remember the fur on the dog-headed upright man being even all over. In fact, I don't believe that it was. It may have even had bald spots on its bodily fur. Sometimes I felt as though I had a flash of seeing the entire creature, and then the bushes would be back hiding the lower half of it. The head had big, giant coyote ears, and its tongue hung out and panted like any canine. It did not look intellectual, it looked savage, except for the way its eyes were focused in on one thing. My sister. It had an expression on its face that was enigmatic. That was a look a dog was not going to make with a human if it was not very familiar with her. It stood perfectly still other than its panting, and it stared at my sister's face. She, in turn, stared blankly back, as though the Dogman were Facebook scrolling in front of her eyes. When I got close enough, I could see that she was actually saying something, or mumbling something at least. I couldn't make out more than a few words here or there, but they seemed to me to be unrelated to each other, as though she were just stringing words together randomly. It creeped me the hell out, and I thought she was going to drool on herself, so I grabbed her by the shoulder. When that and calling her name brought no reaction, I simply pulled her by the shoulder away from the Dogman, breaking her stare at him and forcing her to look at me instead. She appeared as though she were waking from a 7 or 8 hour slumber. When I looked back toward the Dogman, it was no longer where it had once been. My sister appeared like she was trying to tell me something, but after a few moments, I could tell she wasn't really looking at me at all. She was kind of staring past me into space. I took her home and suggested she go to bed. She did as I asked, just as if she might be hypnotized. I sat there shaking my head for a long, long time afterward. Can you beat that? How else can you explain that besides as hypnotism? And if it is what it appears to be, then how exactly is the animal doing that? And what is its ultimate goal? I don't think the creature itself is an illusion because I've seen it myself. The next morning over breakfast, I asked my sister if she remembered anything about the night before. She sounded bland but assured me that she remembered seeing the Dogman, and she remembered the three of us having a conversation. That sent a bolt of adrenaline and fear surging through me because I had no memory of any such event. I only remember seeing her staring and mumbling and drooling. I only remember getting her out of there and putting her to bed. I don't have any memory of the three of us having a conversation. It angered me that she would say that, partially because what she said couldn't possibly be, and partially because it made me doubt my own memories. Could the Dogman be exerting its influence over both of us? Could it have some control over what I think and what I see or hear? I couldn't find any objective way to answer my own questions. Unless I walked around with a 12-person film crew at all times, I had no way of knowing what was real or not real all around me. I could only trust my senses, and our senses are far closer friends with hypnotism than they'll ever be with any of us. My wife and I got out of that house. We got away from that property and back to our own apartment. I urged my sister and her family to follow my lead and find another place to stay. If the Dogman is hypnotizing one of them, then he may be hypnotizing more of them or all of them. Who knows to what end? Maybe one day he'll hypnotize somebody into willingly giving themselves up to be his breakfast or dinner. It just isn't safe to stay out there. Maybe I should have hypnotized my sister and then told her all I've told you. It seems the Dogman has hypnotically assured her that she is safe there at the house. My protestations to her conscious mind, my begging her to leave, none of that will matter as long as he has control of her subconscious. If an event happens in your life, but nobody else is mentally allowed to acknowledge it as having happened, then what is reality exactly? These are the kinds of messed up questions I've been asking myself ever since I saw Dogman hypnotize my sister. The werewolf. That was not from a movie. Dear Scary Stories NYC. Back in the early years of our marriage, my wife and I used to attend parties out at the edge of the suburbs, attended by friends of her boss. We didn't really know anyone out there, and it was nerve-wracking, because anyone there could buy us and sell us. One year, Dolores' boss threw a Halloween party that was intended for families to bring their children to. Our son was only 4, and we tried to get out of bringing him, but we were overruled by her boss. So there he was, in a backyard surrounded by woods, in his Batman costume, running around with other kids his age. The wife and I were panicking, watching him like a hawk. He seemed to be having a ball, though. As the late afternoon party wore on into the early stages of darkness, the host had Halloween games for the kids, bobbing for apples, and then there was a brief ceremony where they were each presented with a terrifying amount of expensive candies and chocolates. We were saying our thank yous and goodbyes as our son was sampling bits of his candy hoard. Suddenly, he bolted from the two of us and raced across the lawn toward the woods in the distance. Dropping everything, I ran after the kid, but he had a big head start, and it seemed that everyone in the party was suddenly going out of their way to trip me up. I actually fell twice, but I kept my eye on our son, and I saw him enter the woods, something he knew not to ever do. It was literally the worst feeling of my life seeing that, as I didn't know if I would ever see my boy again. So I did what any of you would have done. I ran into those dark woods after my son. I was gasping for air and calling his name, unable to see anything in the darkness. As my eyes adjusted, I heard my son giggling, and I could also hear that someone else was there with us, breathing very heavily. "It's okay, Dad," my son told me. "It's only the Wolfman from the Monster Squad." I was slowly able to make out more detail, but I could see it there. I could hear it breathing. There was a man-like thing there, but it wasn't a man. It had the head of a dog, and it was covered in fur, like the Wolfman that my son had seen in that movie. His ears were somewhat like the Wolfman in that flick. I could see where my son had made the connection. But this creature had more of a dog head, not a Wolfman head, a longer snout. It was wearing no clothes, and did not appear to have language or culture. I don't think it was actually any kind of man at all. I think it was a wild beast of some sort. Nevertheless, to my son, this was as exciting as seeing Santa Claus or a superhero in person, and he was standing there in awe, looking up at the monstrous beast. I needed to get him to come back to me. I was afraid to make any moves toward that animal. It was clearly a predator, judging by the thing's teeth. It was not going to be chill if I just walked up and grabbed my kid. That was definitely going to cause something bad to happen. I felt like crying and freaking out, but I knew this was a moment when I had to remain as calm as possible. The dog thing seemed stunned by this situation. It growled and snarled at both of us, which made my son giggle and clap in appreciation. I called to my son quietly, and I told him it was time to go. His mom was waiting for him back at the car. He hesitated, then pouted, and said he didn't want to go. He wanted to stay with the Wolfman. Great. I felt like my heart was going to explode in my chest. That's how hard it was beating. It was hard to even speak. I felt so over-emotional. This was my one chance to save my son's life, though. So I took a deep breath. I put on a smile. And I tried this crazy idea I had in my head. I asked my son if he wanted the Wolfman's autograph. I could see him thinking about it for a few seconds, then his eyes lit up. Yeah, he said enthusiastically. Well, come get my autograph book and pen for me, then you can get him to sign them for you. That plan sounded great to my son, who bounded over to me. I grabbed him in my arms and I stood up as he squealed and fought me. He started screaming so loud, it was ear-piercing. I looked directly into the eyes of that Dogman, and he was wincing in pain from the shouting. I do believe that creature turned and ran before I did. All I know is that he returned to his world, and my son and I returned to our own dreary existence. You would have thought I was killing him the way my son was acting. It was quite embarrassing getting him back to the car. I was unable to properly say goodnight to any of our hosts, but my wife said they didn't hold it against me. They could see that our son was crashing from his sugar high, and they understood my situation. At least, they thought they did. I'm pretty certain they had no guess about why my son had run into those woods in the first place. I never told them, and I never even told my wife. I'm not sure how, but I know it would have led to an argument. My son screamed about the Wolfman half the way home until he fell asleep. My wife never even asked me what he was talking about. She was just exhausted from it all and wasn't the slightest bit curious. Kids that age can live in a fantasy world much of the time, so I guess she just chalked it up to that. It's just as well, because if she had asked me to tell her the truth, I'm not sure what I would have said. After all, what exactly did we encounter? I only know that it wasn't what my son thought it was. But that doesn't mean I know what it was. So let's just refer to it as the werewolf that was not from a movie. Hey, it's me, Henry Lee Dogman, filling in for Bigfoot, who is off announcing baseball games for the Tag Baseball channel. You might enjoy checking that out if you like fun stuff. It's not scary over there, just cartoony. Here at Scary Stories NYC, though, we're planning on keeping it scary with Halloween stories for the rest of the month. And to help us do it, we've got this handsome fellow here. We call him Willy, and in the ensuing weeks, you'll come to understand why. No, he's not replacing me, as some of you might have been hoping, but he's basically our new spokesmodel. Expect to see him in thumbnails, and sometimes even in stories. And we could never have brought Willy into our fold if not for our channel members and paid subscribers, such as today's executive producer, Timothy Walker. He's a good man. He's no stalker. First name Tim, last name Walker. Thank you, sir, for your continued support. We literally couldn't do it without you. One way we thank Timothy is by sending him links each Sunday night to our secret uncensored Dogman stories that only executive producers can watch. If you'd like to be included, just join our paid subscribers club at peterbernard.com, or else become a channel member by clicking the join link under this video. And now for something completely wolfy. The trick or treat, Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I once got chased by a dogman down the street outside of my town, and it happened on Halloween no less. This was a long time ago, but I'll try to remember as many details as I can. I was, I guess, 16 or 17. I was too old to be trick-or-treating, but I was anyway. My excuse was that I had to take my little sister and brother and some of their friends out trick-or-treating, but I was trick-or-treating just as much as they were. Two of my buddies, who we can call Mac and Jack, came along as well. I don't remember most of the costumes, but I know my sister was a princess, same as every year, and my little brother was going as Charlie Brown, going as a ghost. He had holes all over a sheet thrown over his head, and that was the costume. I think my friends and me went as pirates or something like that. This was back at the end of the golden era of trick-or-treating. We didn't know back then how lucky we were. We did enjoy the hell out of it though, and we were all on a sugar high. The rule was that no candy could be eaten until after it had been inspected by one of us 3 older kids, and the 3 older kids, we would charge them 1 piece of candy per inspection. It was a pretty good deal. I thought it up myself. A splendid time was had by all, and the evening started to draw to a close. We had reached the end of the line, the edge of the town, and it was time to walk each of the kids back home. I was feeling tired, so I figured the kids were probably ready for bed. I was completely wrong about that assumption. They didn't want to go home. They wanted to visit one more house. They were staring up at it, the old house on the hill. None of us had ever been there before, and I know that because I asked them all outright, have any of you ever been there before? And they all said, no. It technically was out of town, I said. One of the smart-ass kids disagreed and informed us all of the town boundaries in some detail. It turns out he had just done a school report on the subject not long prior, and that house, with the hill under it, were all definitely inside our town. None of us had the strength to argue with him. I tried saying that our parents didn't allow us to go up that hill to the old Addams family house up there, but we all knew that wasn't true. They never had to ban us from visiting there, as none of us had ever had the slightest desire to. There was nothing up that road except the house, and by the looks of it, that would be a good 15 or 20-minute walk just to reach a creepy old mansion owned by people we never actually saw with our own eyes. Why would anyone do that? So, no, we weren't banned from going to the haunted old place, same as our parents never banned us from flying to the moon. They didn't have to ban us because they knew it wasn't going to happen. It wasn't logical. It was impossible. Except, this was Halloween night, and it seemed that some in our party considered it very possible. The younger kids were going to rebel. They really wanted to walk all the way up that hill just for one house that might not even have any candy in it. We could see the lights in the house on, so I couldn't argue that no one was home. So instead, I argued that the place was haunted. That was the wrong thing to say because my buddies Mac and Jack lit up at that. Suddenly, they were on the side of the kids, arguing that Halloween was the best and most perfect time to visit a haunted house. They told me it would be a story I could tell my grandchildren. Little did they know how right they were. We started up this hill, and we were all silent, just walking. Clearly, they were all as nervous about this as I was. They liked the idea of walking up to the creepy old house on the hill, but it wasn't so much fun to actually be doing it. One of my sister's friends complained that her feet were starting to hurt, and we were barely even started up that long winding path. There were trees lining the road on both sides, but none of them seemed to have any leaves on them. It was as though it were the dead of winter, but it was actually a warm night in late October. Most of the leaves in town were red and orange, but they were still half up in the trees and in the process of falling down. Not so on that hill. Everything seemed dead up there in the first part of our trek. Off in the distance down the winding road, I noticed evergreen trees and bushes, which made me think even more about winter time. Somehow, that made the experience even more unsettling. You know, it was just a dirt path that wound around and round that old tall hill up to the old creepy house. But that night, it had all the feel of a scene from a horror movie. I forget if I said that or someone else, but we were all thinking that same thing. It felt like we were walking into a monster flick on Halloween night. Mist or fog was all around, covering our feet. It was really beautiful out, but it felt dreadful. I bet this place is really nice during the day, I said, but at night, it's like the path to Frankenstein's secret lab or something. Nobody laughed. We were all pretty uptight. I think everyone really wanted to give up and run, but nobody wanted to be the person who said it. Finally, when we were all panting and huffing and puffing at the steep climb, but we still weren't getting even halfway up, I decided I should be the one to risk being the jerk. I got up in front of everybody and turned around to face them, blocking their path. I launched into a speech about why it wasn't worth it to continue, but almost as soon as I started, the kids screamed and ran away from me. Then my buddies basically did the same thing, and I realized I had something troubling coming up from behind me. I ran after my friends before turning my head around. I was that certain that all the kids plus my buddies all agreeing on something like that meant it must be legit. I wondered if the property owner was behind me chasing us. I was wondering specifically if he was in any way armed. When I turned around for a split-second glance at what or who was behind us, my mind did not understand what my eyes were telling it. Well, it understood well enough that I was now officially flooded with adrenaline and screaming as I ran. My nervous system and I grasped that we were in danger and that we were being pursued. The trouble was that what was pursuing the lot of us wasn't something real. It couldn't possibly have been real since it was a werewolf. Or really now people would probably say it was a dogman. It was man-shaped for the most part, but it had a dog's head up on top. It was bipedal, which added to its humanoid appearance, and it was chasing us while on its hind legs. Now, if you want to argue that it was someone in a costume chasing kids on Halloween for kicks, I couldn't swear on a stack of Bibles that it couldn't have been. It was mostly shaped like a man. The thing is, the legs were weird shaped, so that guy would have had to have been running on his tiptoes or something, but he looked pretty sure-footed. He seemed like someone or something that was way more used to going up and down that steep incline than my friends and I were. I never, in that moment, doubted for a second that this was something real that actually lived on that mountain. Could I have been fooled? Maybe. I was still very young, but I was a fan of monster and horror films back then, and I was pretty familiar with the state of the art in the industry in those days too. The werewolf or dog-headed monster man that chased us that Halloween night might have been a creation of a makeup effects genius, but if so, it would have to have been their masterpiece. This performance, if that's what it was done live, and it sure looked real. I don't mean it looked impressive or striking. I thought that dog monster thing wanted to eat me and the others, and I didn't know if we were going to live to tell this particular Halloween story. As we entered the town proper, where the roads were level and paved again, the creature seemed to stop following us. None of us actually saw when it cut off its chase, but once we were in town, it just appeared to be gone. We got ourselves home as quickly as possible anyway, all of us agreeing that we'd keep quiet about everything that had happened once we started walking up that tall hill. And we did keep quiet about it too. Nobody got punished, nobody got a lecture. It remained our little secret. But if even one of us had been caught by that dogman or werewolf on that night, it would have been a very different story. It would have altered the rest of our lives, and nothing could have ever been the same again. Instead, we got away, and it was just the same as if nothing had ever happened. That was one of a number of times in my life where if things had been just slightly different, I would have passed on, or my life would have been drastically altered. One seemingly slight change could alter everything. It's overwhelming to think about it, because there's nothing you can do. We control what we can, and the rest of life is a complete mystery to most of us most of the time. Both the atheists and the deists like to pretend that they've got it figured out, and all questions in the world are answered by their philosophies and their faiths. But the real truth is that we can explain or control very little of what happens in our lives. Just when you think you have everything figured out, along comes the trick-or-treat Dogman. Welcome to Scary Stories NYC. I'm Henrey Dogman. I'll be your host for today. Bigfoot has a lunch date with Jeff Meldrum in their own private Idaho. Seriously, I wish I could get a dog lady to look at me the way Dr. Meldrum looks at old Biggity. Oh, who am I kidding? I'm just jealous. I guess I wish there were a serious university professor trying to prove that I'm real. After all, Dogman sightings now spread just as wide as Bigfoot sightings. Take today's all-new, allegedly true story submitted anonymously by one of you viewers out there, for example. It supposedly happened in a nice, upper-class, suburban neighborhood in New Jersey, and that would explain why we call the story The Dogman of West Orange, New Jersey. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a story for you that happened many years ago in West Orange, New Jersey. You might think of that as too suburban a place for a Dogman story to have happened in, but even to this day, they actually have a lot of natural and wild areas right there and down to the south of it. Hardly anyone I knew back then still lives there, as none of our generation can afford it. Those who remain do so in their parents' basements, I suppose. For a couple years there, my older brother Lester was friends with a real jerk who would do mean things to me. Let's call him Chester. Lester never wanted to go against Chester, and he would betray me for any reason and in any way if Chester wanted him to. I never understood why, but he was desperate to keep Chester on his side. It went on until one day he woke up and realized Chester was a jerk. I've asked him about it since then. Why was he so loyal to Chester all that time, almost 2 years? He just gets angry at me for reminding him, but I still kind of feel like he owes me an explanation and an apology. I mean, he should apologize for a whole lot of different creepy things he helped Chester do, but most especially, he should apologize to me sometime before he dies for the stuff I'm about to tell you about. I'm lucky to still even be alive. I'm lucky I had a chance to grow up. And I almost lost everything because Lester was so eager to go along with Chester on this one particular Saturday night as we walked home along Northfield Avenue. The street that my family lived on, Lenox Terrace, was a little bit exclusive and harder to get to, especially from that angle. That was by design, so that we wouldn't get any traffic on our block that wasn't one of the homeowners or one of their invited guests. As you can see from this overhead view, to get to Lenox Terrace from Northfield Avenue by driving, one would have to go all the way around to the north somewhere. To get home by walking, we'd either have to cut up Rock Spring Avenue, then go down the little path through the trees, or maybe we could cut through the restaurant parking lot and get to it that way. On this day, however, Chester the Creep had a better idea. He and Lester would force me to walk through the woods home by myself. Now, I don't mean down the path in those woods accessible from Rock Spring Avenue. I mean walk through the center of those woods from Northfield Avenue over by the Turtleback Rock formations. We used to call those woods Addict Alley because there was a rumor that the place was strewn with hypodermic needles and that it was dangerous to walk through. A kid at school told me that a friend of his brother's friend had walked through there. accidentally stepped on a needle, and then they died of AIDS. So I never walked through that patch of trees. I was convinced that drug fiends were waiting there to jab me with their needles, and it terrified me. Seems comical now that I've actually lived in bad areas in real life to think that there could have been a drug alley in a pretty little patch of trees down the road from my parents' posh status symbol of a home. But how could I have known that there was actually something far more dangerous lurking inside those innocent little woods? I walked a few steps under the tree cover. I had thought it was dark out that evening, but we were walking under street lamps. That little patch of woods was much, much darker, and I wanted to let my eyes adjust to the darkness a while before walking in there and getting blinded. Chester and Lester were both jeering me from behind, though, calling me names and using their evil superpower of social pressure to get me into that darkness. If I didn't amuse them how they demanded I do it, then they would make up lies about me and spread them around the school. I knew they would do it, too, because they had already done it before. I sighed deeply and resigned myself to my fate. I was going to walk through the darkness until the woods led me to my family's backyard. Then I would be home free. If I got lucky, I might even get home before my brother, and maybe I could tell my mother what he had made me do. Actually, that would probably just make Chester and Lester find some way to hurt me even worse. So I probably was not going to tell my mother anything about any of this. But I could fantasize about it on the way home to try to ease the torment of this entire experience. So that was part one of my strategy, to stay inside my own head and ignore the fact that I was in a scary woods, alone, where something could jump out at me any second. Part two of how I decided to approach this was to keep my eyes focused on the ground immediately in front of me. If there were needles strewn about in there for real, then my top priority should be to avoid stepping on them. My strategy for how to deal with druggies or other bad guys I might encounter in there was entirely non-existent. Possibly I should say my strategy was to hope that they weren't really in there, or maybe that the cops drove them away if they had once been in there. Basically, if anyone else was hiding inside the darkness and they wanted to mess with me, I was screwed. I was a kid. I was defenseless. And I was a real chicken too in those days. My mother used to call me a nervous Nelly. My dad used to call me ruder things than that, which I won't repeat here. Lester wasn't the only member of my family who enjoyed scaring me, as my cousins, who lived in Kearney, would team up to scare me whenever they visited. They would jump out and shout "boo" at me so often that you would have thought I'd have gotten used to it. But instead, it worked every single time. They would get me to scream, then they'd all fall down laughing at how high-pitched my squealing was. This seemed hysterical to them at the time. Since my cowardice was legendary, people competed to see who could scare me the worst. Back in the present, I walked slowly into the woods, eyes trained on the ground in front of me. I was trying to listen forward and to ignore the rude shouting of discouraging and undermining words coming from Lester and Chester behind me. I stopped after a few steps and cautiously turned my eyes up, then my head. It was still really dark in there, and I couldn't be sure what I was seeing. I blinked my eyes a few times, but it was taking a while to get my night vision going on. Staring hard at the dirt and grass at my feet, I cautiously took a few more steps forward, then repeated the procedure. After a while, I was seeing as well as I was gonna be seeing without a flashlight, and with the overhead canopy blocking out even the light of the stars and the moon. I went into a kind of young person's version of Zen. I really surrendered to the moment, and I tried to stop thinking anything. I used as much of my nervous system as possible to observe and listen. Awareness and attention were the only two words in my head, and they were there more as guideposts to keep me on the road than as actual words or concepts. I remember looking downward with great concentration, making sure I didn't trip over something, and making sure I didn't step on anything that would hurt. When I looked up and around, I remember sort of unfocusing my eyes to pay as much attention to the periphery of my vision as the center of it. Any sound or movement in any direction could then be instantly focused on for examination. But until then, I'd be far more aware of any changes in my surroundings than if I looked around in my normal fashion. I was also allowing myself to remain detached by doing things this way. I don't think I could have made it through those woods that night in any other manner, because if I had allowed myself to think, I would have reminded myself of the dangerous reputation of those woods, and that would have made me too scared to move. I would have thought about how unfair it was that I was being placed in danger for no good reason whatsoever, and that would have made me angry. I could also have thought about the fact that my own brother was one of the people placing me in possible mortal danger, and that would have probably made me sad and depressed. So, better not to think at all, except about the present moment and surviving to experience more and more of the now. I remember images of my bedroom and my mother flashing in my mind, both of which made me feel stressed. I remember banishing both images and concepts and refocusing on the dirt on the ground in front of me. The next time I stopped to look around, I saw that I was about to enter a much thicker part of that patch of the woods. There was no clearly defined path that I could see. I looked behind to see if I might have wandered off the path I was following, but I saw no path behind me at all in the dark night. Had I imagined it? I was going to have to squeeze between and climb over and under stuff in order to make it home now. It wasn't going to be as easy as it seemed before. And so, that's what I did. I got pretty dirty pretty much right away, as a tree I was holding onto for support proved slipperier than I had anticipated. I went down, twisting my right ankle and swallowing some dirt and dust in the process. I never coughed so hard in my life. I had a coughing fit. My chest and back both ached from it, and my ankle was too raw to even touch as well. I had really blown it, and I knew it. I was wiping ants off of my hand when I saw a dog looking at me through the bushes. I only saw it for a second, and I saw it upside down because of the way I was laying back on the turtle-shaped rock I had fallen onto. But it was a dog, and it looked alarmed by my presence. I tried to sit up and position myself to see the creature better when I heard a growling coming from that general direction, and I started to realize I was in a serious bit of trouble. No matter how hard I looked, I couldn't regain my view of the dog's eyes, but I could still hear the growling sound, which was now mixing in snarls and barks. Then I noticed the sounds seemed to be moving up in the air, and I panicked, thinking the dog was climbing a tree to pounce on me. I know, dogs don't do that, but adrenaline shot through me because it seemed like that was what was happening. Looking up, what I saw was not a dog climbing into a tree like a big cat. What I saw was a dog standing up on its hind legs like a man. Towering over me, staring down at me, was a very tall, humanoid dog. Or maybe a dog-headed man. I'm not really sure myself. It looked like a dog when it was down on all fours, but when it stood up, its chest appeared to broaden, and it seemed more man-shaped than it should have possibly been able to seem. I apologize if that description seems to contradict itself, as this animal, or whatever it was, appeared to contradict basic common sense and what we think of as reality. It seemed more like a computer animation than a real creature, in the sense that it reminded me of the Transformers, when it stood up or squatted back down. Then in either state, it appeared normal and real. I can't explain it any better than that. So, I was stuck there, and I was at the Dogman's mercy. The thing is, I got the distinct impression that he or it wanted me to leave. I couldn't, though, so the dog remained agitated. I tried to sit up once and it dropped to all fours and was on me and right in my face almost instantly, snarling with its teeth less than half an inch from my nose. After a while, I realized that the only thing I could do was lie there as still as possible. The Dogman remained agitated and it continued to growl and snarl and occasionally bark at me, but at least when I stood still, it stayed where it was. I wondered how long the Dogman was going to be there, and I wondered if it left. What would I do to get home? I couldn't crawl home since this area I was in was all bushes and tree roots that came up out of the ground, plus big turtle-shaped rocks and so forth. I had a long list of things to worry about. I was in a lot of pain, and I was becoming increasingly frightened. It was then that I remembered I hadn't screamed when I fell. I was scared and I was hurt, but I had not screamed my trademark high-pitched scream. And even when the Dogman was in my face, I didn't scream then either. I didn't know the word Zen, but I knew something about the way I had been acting on the way into this mess had allowed me to remain distanced from my fear and nervousness. Somehow I had evolved past the caricature of the easily frightened coward, and yet somehow, even in that state of heightened awareness, I had still managed to injure my ankle, eliminate my means of mobility, and trap myself under an angry Dogman that was by then drooling onto me. Now, some of you may have your BS alarms going off right now. A Dogman in a small patch of trees in the middle of a well-off suburbs is even less likely than the collection of junkies I had expected to find there. It's not a large enough habitat for a big land predator to survive in. Well, that's absolutely true. But, you see, I have neglected to tell you about what was across the street from that little patch of trees. A whole lot more trees, and trees, and trees, and a reservoir, and then a whole heck of a lot more trees stretching further and further and further onward to the south. Then after that comes the South Mountain Reservation, which is miles and miles of nature. Then, guess what lies beyond that? Right, more trees and more nature. In other words, there is actually a surprising amount of land in West Orange and the immediate vicinity southward that could actually, in fact, support the survival of a large, hairy, dog-headed hominid or canid, at least in theory, and at least for a temporary period. Since I've never heard any other stories or urban legends about the Dogman being in that area, it seems very possible to me that it was migrating through that place. It might have been the only time that creature ever came through that part of New Jersey, and in fact, it might even be the only time any creature of that species walked through there as far as I know. Another theory I have was actually suggested to me by that idiot Chester. He kept calling what I saw a werewolf when we would talk about it later. At the time, I was angry at Lester for telling Chester about the Dogman at all, as I had asked him to keep it just between me and him. I hadn't told any adults. After I calmed down a bit, though, I realized that the idea of a werewolf or wolfman might not be that crazy a thought after all. It might explain what he was doing there in the suburbs. Maybe he was actually human most of the time and was one of my neighbors. Maybe even someone I knew. Crazy idea, right? But if so, whoever they were, they kept a low profile afterward and never revealed themselves to me. It might also have been a shaman, and again, in that case, might not have been a long-term resident of the area. At any rate, whatever it was, got spooked when my family came searching for me, calling my name out. I was wondering if they would notice that I had never made it home. Thankfully, Lester told them the last he'd seen of me was me walking into those woods, so that was the first place that my parents and brother looked. They called out my name. I dared to call back, risking setting the Dogman off again. Instead, he seemed preoccupied with their approach. It seemed he was counting how many of them there were compared to how many of him, and he decided to back off and let me be rescued. That was the end of Chester and Lester being able to make fun of me for screaming like a mouse when I got scared. Something sort of changed in me that day. After all, it isn't everyone who can claim that they survived an encounter with the Dogman of West Orange, New Jersey.
Thanks for watching till the end. If you liked what you saw, please consider clicking like on the video or sharing it. You can become a channel member by clicking the join link below. Then you can check our community page to find the links to 10 hours or more of secret, uncensored Dogman stories too wild to be told on this channel. Your other option is to join our paid subscribers club at peterbernard.com. That's Peter's homemade club, where he will personally email you the links as well as occasional secret club messages. You may also be included as an executive producer in a future episode. You have a scary experience you want to tell us about? You can email us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com, or else call our Scary Stories voicemail hotline at 804-LESS-SCARY. The machine cuts off every few minutes, so if you have a long story, please keep calling back and we'll piece it together later on. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.